Thank you, thank you. Am I blocking the screen for some of you? Should I scoot over? Can you see? Okay, okay. So I'm going to do this very informally. And I welcome questions throughout. This is a small group, so I think we can work something like that. If you'd rather save them till the end, that's fine as well. I threw in some slides that people in the back may not be able to read, so please treat them as placeholders. They'll remind me of what it is I need to say. They might be full of text, but I'll parse them into something that is understandable. So what it is that I'm focusing on is a time period in Egypt that we call the Third Intermediate Period. And I'm looking specifically, actually I can go to my chronology slide. I'm looking specifically at this shift from the late Bronze, end of Dynasty 20 into Dynasty 21. So that liminal period between the end of the New Kingdom and then the beginning of what we Egyptologists call the Third Intermediate Period. And it's a time period when Egypt was fragmented within itself. So you have, and yeah, if you could take, there's a light on here. Should I? It's right here, this one. There. We've got a king in the north who only seemingly has control over the northeast delta. So it's a difficult situation. And then we have other little warlords possibly down here in the middle. And then down in the south in Thebes, we've got the high priesthood of Amun that's really running the show. So we have two real political centers. And in some cases, it can be a competition, but this doesn't break out into true civil war. There seems to be a lot of cooperation within what is understood to be a very decentralized, very confusing time period, economically, ideologically, socially, and certainly politically. Now, many Egyptologists focus on Thebes, and there's a reason they do, because there is so much stuff from this particular location. So this is where most of the material that I'll be talking to you about today comes from. And most of the material will be coming from areas out here in the west, the land of the dead, particularly around Dir el-Bahri, which is not, where are we, right here. Caches of Third Intermediate Period, particularly 21st Dynasty coffins. And our high priesthood of Amun, of course, would have ruled from these temple locations here, Temple of Karnak, Temple of Luxor. Now, I've broken this up into three main sources of evidence. Funerary architecture on the one hand, coffins next, and then mummies. We'll round out this discussion. And let me, do I want to go back? Yeah, let me go back to the slide to start it off. It's a little disorganized just to begin with. Sorry. So imagine in the New Kingdom, at the height of the New Kingdom, 18th dynasty, time period of Amenhotep III, perhaps, when we have a funerary culture for the elites, always for the elites, that demands a tremendous amount of spending for death. We're putting money into coffins, painted, decorated coffins. We're putting money into painted and decorated architecture, the tomb chapels themselves. We're burying the dead with furniture, with wigs, with unguents, with bread and beer and wine and scribal palettes and all of the things that somebody might want to bring with them into the next life. Now imagine that you've hit a problem, you've hit a snag with this spending for death, this conspicuous consumption for death, with all of this display. And that snag is an economic recession. Great social upheaval, great political decentralization as well. All of those things are going to come with this problem. But when you're talking about the spending part of this, you're then hit up against a tremendous amount of scarcity. And all of these notions of burying one's loved one in a materiality that will transform them after death are going to be negotiated, because you're not going to have access to this material in the same way that you had before. So I think it's important, even though I have no direct access to it, it's important to think of the emotional aspects here. If you have a loved one and your mother has just died and you're thinking, my God, you know, we need to bury her. We have funds. We have ample funds. We're the high priests of Amun. We've got money coming out of our ears, but we have little access to wood. The trade routes have shut down. It's hard to get artisans who are really trained in what it is that I'm looking for. How am I going to deal with this problem? And we see negotiations taking place that I think are that we don't often look for because we assume that they shouldn't exist. And what I am looking at is theft, reuse, usurpation. This is something that most Egyptologists have not thought could be truly possible, that you could have evidence that a coffin has been reused 3 times, 4 times. And I'm seeing it now that I'm looking for it. I'm seeing all kinds of plaster overlay and reuse that we haven't thought to look for. I think because we have in our minds crystallized this notion that if you spend for death, it's done. You put it in a hole in the ground, that's the way it's meant to be. If tomb robbery takes place, it will be recommodified, but not necessarily for someone else who has died. But that's not the situation that takes place from what I'm looking at this particular time period. You have a lot of spending for death, and then people come in who are often the same family members of people who buried this dead person 3 or 4 generations before. They come into their tomb, pull material out of that tomb, and reuse it for the next generation of dead. So it's a recycling for the dead, and that creates a host of interesting negotiations. And that's what I'll be focusing on for the next 40 minutes. And some of the slides, again, I'll blow through, but we'll see how this works. So in all of my discussion, whether it's funerary arts or mummies or coffins, I always try to focus on there's still a light on, isn't there? Or is that just the light? Oh, it's backlit. Never mind. No, it's fine. It's fine. It just looks weird to me. It's so backlit that it washes it out. I'm always going to be looking at the object on the one hand and then texts on the other. I really try to keep this contextual approach. Egyptology has been far too splintered between the objects on the one hand and the texts on the other. And if we have texts that tell us about the objects, why should we not include this? So that's my perspective. So let's start out with the funerary architecture. And I start with the text. And I know you can't read this, and it's fine. This is a placeholder for me. Now, what this slide is showing, I can condense it very quickly, is that in the 19th dynasty, a time period of peace and prosperity, time period of Ramses the Great, time period when things are going well, we have people able to spend money on tombs. Tombs that are the chapel above ground and the burial chamber below ground. And we have receipts from Western Thebes that show that money of some sort, either in grain form or in metal form, is changing hands between an artisan and a commissioner, and I have evidence for people spending money on tombs, a reasonable amount. And in some cases, a reasonable amount of money. Here we have 240 Deben, which would be at least 8 months of a craftsman's salary. So we're lots of money is changing hands. Now, by the time we get to the 20th dynasty, and we look at the evidence for the decoration, the creation and decoration of tomb chapels, we see a precipitous drop. There is not the same amount, I have no prices at all from this time period, which is extraordinary. It's extraordinary for one main reason, because most of my textual data set from Western Thebes comes from the 20th dynasty. So I would say 80% of the texts that I work with from Western Thebes are 20th dynasty texts. The fact that none of them have prices for tombs at all, I think is telling. It's not a huge data set. For the 19th dynasty, I'm dealing with 7 or 8 different prices, and then for the 20th, I have none. So it seems to me telling. Now, that doesn't mean that some people weren't building tombs. And this is an excavation that was done recently in the past 7 years, about 7 years ago, by a German archaeologist named Daniel Poltz. And he found this wonderful, grand, monumental funerary structure belonging to a high priest of Amun and his family, and the name of the guy is Ramses Nacht. And he carefully excavated this structure and have found no traces of burial whatsoever. No mummy beads, no wrappings of any kind, no linen bandages, no traces of any bodies of any kind. I've worked in these Theban tombs, and the paraphernalia of death in a tomb is everywhere. Even just walking around in the Western hills, you see beads all over, you see mummy bandages all over. There's a tremendous detritus associated with death. And this was clean. The site was clean. So what it seems we have here is that if wealthy elites, and there's only very few of them, right now we're discussing 99% versus 1%, we're going to have to narrow that down even more and talk about 0.2% of the one. I mean, this is, you know, one guy. We have evidence for one guy who's able to build a tomb during this very difficult time period, going from the late Bronze into the Iron Age. And he doesn't, as far as the archaeological information suggests, he doesn't have his family buried at this location. And he's only building a monumental structure to have cult activity, to have access to the dead, but he doesn't want to place his bodies in the structure. I'll come back to this idea in a bit. But even the people who are able to build monumental tombs, let me cut to the chase a little bit, do not believe enough in the security of the necropolis to place their bodies and their riches and their wealth there. So he's putting the monumental structure up, he's probably got it guarded, but he's not secure enough in the belief that as the generations go by, this will be protected. So no bodies here. Now, in the 19th dynasty, and throughout Egyptian history, during times of centrality, during times when there is a secure necropolis, the tomb usually had three main parts. You have a superstructure. So here we have a pyramid, which is typical for an elite, non-royal tomb in Western Thebes. So we have the superstructure here, and then you have your chapel that the living would be welcome to come into. There they could commune with the dead, give offerings to the dead, all of those things. And then below ground we have the burial chamber, area that would have been ideally sealed off, just closed after you interred the dead in the burial chamber. It could be opened up again if this is a family tomb and you want to place more people into the tomb as they die. You could open it up, but then you're always meant to seal it after you place someone in it. That's our 19th dynasty ideal for the elites. By the time we get to the 21st, this is condensed down into just that lower level. You get rid of the marker. You cannot afford to mark your tomb and show people where everything is, where all the goods are at. So you do not mark it. And you don't have a chapel of any kind, which is, it creates, this is where my work is going, and I don't have time to talk about this, but imagine that emotional lack of being able to commune with the dead, of not being able to give them the bread and beer and talk to them and go and visit. That connection with the bodies is now going to be missing, because you're not meant to know where the dead are buried. You must try to keep it secret. And so what we have is a condensation down to the burial chamber alone, and an unmarked burial chamber. Ideally, if you're rich enough, a secret burial chamber. I have a slide of it later on. A burial chamber that might be in a cliffside where you'd have to rappel down into it, and taking goods out of it would be very, very difficult. We're talking about a time period when people would probably want to be buried in the dead of night, when no one would really know what was going on or be able to see it in large numbers. And we're also talking about a time period when the display of death, that moment of conspicuous consumption, of showing all of the things that you had commissioned and purchased for death, would be displayed, but then not interred in the location where they're meant to be interred, because that is too much information. Again, I must infer that. I don't have that information directly, but I think it's probably safe to say that when there was display, they did not do it at the location of the tomb itself, especially when it's on a cliffside. It makes it difficult. Now, in the 20th dynasty, I have, and just to be clear, I have 19th dynasty texts, I have 20th dynasty texts, I have very few 21st dynasty texts. They just, you know, the preservation isn't there, or we don't have the settlement system, the system in place that encourages people to write on ostraca and then to throw them into a trash pit that we archaeologists can find. There was probably writing, a lot of it on papyrus, and a lot of that does not survive to us, which is very annoying to me, but I'll survive. I'll figure it out. So in the 20th dynasty, I see a new word pop up, which is fun. I only see it 3 times, but it's a new word, and it's a set keres, a place of burial. And the texts are all legal in nature, and a lot of them include lawsuits, or how are we going to get this person buried, or I'm going to provide my parents with a set keres. And the set keres seems to be a place of burial within an already existing cash tomb. So we see more of an interest as the New Kingdom is waning in placing all of these people as a community together into a protected cash burial, as opposed to a nuclear family here, a nuclear family there, a nuclear family here. They're all getting together. They're all cooperating in terms of security, and we assume secrecy. That's a problem we'll bring up later. And those people are burying themselves together, and we have an interest in creating a space within these larger burial structures. So this is a new thing, new idea. And this burial caching that we see from the late Bronze onward is really a universal adaptation. It includes the poor as well as the rich. And this is one of those few times when you see such an adaptation that the poor have been using for millennia, because the poor have to cooperate. They have to negotiate with one another. They don't have the means to have discrete nuclear family tombs. This isn't something that's possible for them given the scarcity that's facing them. This is one adaptation that moves from the lower strata of society up. So that's interesting to me. Okay, so that's all I've got for the tombs. And then let me move on to the coffins, which is really my dearest love. I just got back from Italy, and I was there for a month, and I went through the storage areas of 21st Dynasty coffins that people haven't looked at in a long time in Turin, in Rome, and in Florence. Naples wouldn't let me in. Are we surprised? We should not be surprised. By the time I got to Naples, there's trash all over on the streets. It was not an option. And I was looking specifically, and I'm continuing, this research is going to continue for a number of years because there are over 700 of these coffins, probably about 1,000 of these 21st Dynasty coffins that will keep me busy for some time. I'm looking specifically for evidence of usurpation, tomb robberies, harder to find in a coffin, but reuse of some kind. That's what I'm looking for. But let me start with the prices first. This will be my foundation. Now, as we look from the 19th dynasty to the 20th dynasty, we see that the highest prices for coffins paid through time are in the 20th dynasty, not in the 19th. Right? So what I saw before with the tombs is lots of tombs in the 19th, lots of spending, and then no spending. And people seem to be reusing tomb spaces, family tomb spaces, instead of building new tombs. Here with the coffins, we have lots of spending for the 19th dynasty, but by the time we get to the 20th, people are spending much more on their coffin sets than they had previously. And the coffin sets that are, according to the text, really tricked out with all kinds of embellishments that have all kinds of fabulous methods of construction or methods of painting or inlay, those coffins belong to the 20th dynasty. And that seems to be a trend. In fact, talking with some Deir el-Medina scholars, people that really work on this Western Theban stuff, a lot of the people that are involved in selling these very high-priced coffins are some of the same people that are mentioned in the tomb robbery papyri. So these are the same guys that are benefiting from a lot of the re-commodification, if I may use a more or less loaded term, of the elite tombs in Western Thebes. The same people that are benefiting are selling very, very high-priced coffins. So that's an interesting connection, particularly the guy, Hori Sherry. I know you can't read this. And I notice, so those are the super high-priced coffins of an elite that is really there at the top of the social stratum. If I look at the coffins of everybody over time, and this is, let me be clear, the coffins of everybody who could afford a coffin. We're talking about 5% of society, more or less. Not everyone could afford a coffin. This is something that is still an elite endeavor. For those people, even if somebody could just scrape together the funds for a basic wooden container that you would put the body into, those prices are also going up over time. And I see a 25% increase over time. And then if you add inflation of grain to that, in real prices, that could be even more. So we also see a change in these coffin prices through time, which is interesting. So it seems, if I want to make a conclusion, linking this together with the tomb material, it seems to me that people are not able to, because of necropolis security, place their money into a decorated tomb. And instead, they're placing their money into a decorated coffin. And that decorated coffin is absorbing, socially and religiously, many of the functions that the tomb before had provided. And that coffin is becoming a discrete tomb for the person that is placed inside it. So it is a definite shift. And the notion that scarcity could encourage a change in ritual and religious practice, could encourage a change in religious belief, is very interesting to me. That the economics starts that ball rolling, because people do change the way they approach the dead, the way the materiality starts it, and then we have these new ideas of what the dead are, where they dwell, how they come back and forth between the realms of the dead and living. It's very interesting the way the money and the religion is connected here. And the coffins themselves, as this shifts from the 19th to the 20th to the 21st, it's amazing how you can see the coffins absorbing these functions of the tomb. Now, that is not to say that the exact things that you would see on a tomb wall of the 19th dynasty are being taken one-to-one and placed onto a coffin of Dynasty 20. It's not that simple. Instead, it's that the function of the pyramid on the top is a solar image that is linking the dead to the sun god himself and melding the two together for that transformation. That religious idea is then pulled out of the tomb and put onto the coffin. They use different iconography to do it, but this new iconography is now popping up like crazy onto the coffin. And you see this really cool connection between the Osirian and the solar on these coffins of the 21st, which you don't see before. And you can link it all back to this economic scarcity. I don't want to be that simplistic about it, but I do think that that's one of the things that starts this very complex dynamic in rethinking materiality. The other thing that I hope you notice, oh, maybe you can't notice it at all. There's nothing we can do to change that, huh?
Could we try turning off the light?
In the room? Is there a light in the projection room?
I think I can see underneath.
Because I know you guys can't see that at all.
Oh, it's locked.
Key? No one has a key? The other door? Let's see. So if you can't see, no. Because this isn't right. There's got to be a way to, yay. Okay. Yes. Oh, alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. Now, right. That's much better. Okay, good. Yay. Now you can see I know you can't see me, but that's not important, right? This is what's important. Look at how much empty space there is on this 19th dynasty coffin. And then they're filling that space. And then we have a horror vacui, you could call it, right? A fear of empty space by the time you get to the 21st. So that as time goes on, every bit of empty space is filled. And interestingly, and I don't think by mistake, the interiors of 21st dynasty coffins are decorated for the first time. So now if you opened up this 19th dynasty coffin, you would just see a rich black resin on the inside. And then 20th dynasty, same kind of thing. Actually, the resin is pretty scarce, so a lot of 20th dynasty coffins don't have any of that rich black resin. By the time you get to the 21st, you have decorations of all kinds of religious iconography on the inside, very richly done, very carefully decorated. And you're placing the body of the dead into that decorated space, so it is like its own discrete tomb. This one, I don't have time to talk about. The only point I was going to make is that you can see these changes within one generation at a certain place in Western Thebes. You can see how you have empty space on the figure on the left, and then by the time you get to the image, the coffins on the right, there is imagery placed into those empty spaces, and then that trend will continue. It's interesting how you can see it through time pretty clearly. And then if we compare the case sides, there's two things that are interesting here. Number one, in the 19th dynasty, that's the coffin on the top, on the case side, there's a great deal of text. And that text is condensed and reduced for the 21st dynasty coffin, which is interesting. It seems that we're dealing with, and this is across the board, 21st dynasty coffins have less text. They have less Book of the Dead text, chapter 161, 151, those chapters that are associated, 17 sometimes, with coffin decoration. And instead, we're including pithy statements or very complex iconography that could have in a miniaturized scarab sort of way, that could have 3 or 4 different meanings. There's much more flexibility with that lack of text. When you put the full text out on this 19th dynasty coffin, then I think you can only go in one clear direction with it. But if your coffin is the only thing you've got, it seems they pull back on the explicit text and instead focus on iconography that is much more flexible, malleable, expandable, you could say, in terms of its religious meaning, ritual meaning. And of course the ritual meaning is the thing that we also try to get at, but it's tough. The other thing that I find very noticeable as we move from the 19th to the 20th is the amount of creativity that the commissioner and the artisan is now allowed. We did not see before to a large extent in the 19th dynasty, certainly not in the 18th dynasty before that. It's interesting that during times of centrality, political, economic, ideological centrality. You see people following certain rules with their coffins. This is the way it's meant to be done. We put this Book of the Dead text here. We put Anubis here. We put the 4 sons of Horus here and here. And we follow these rules very carefully. And so if I compared this coffin to other 19th dynasty coffins, particularly the case sides, I would see them repeating and people following these same rules. By the time we get to the 20th dynasty and then into the 21st after it, these rules are not being followed. And people are competing with one another through their ingenuity, or the ingenuity of their craftsmen, but they're competing with one another with what amazing and perhaps previously unattainable text and iconography they're putting on their case sides. So that's a new and different thing, which I find very interesting. Remember, who's in charge at Thebes? High Priesthood of Amun. It's a very intellectual group of guys who are constantly dealing, in other texts we can see, dealing with this notion of what divinity is and what divinity in time of crisis means. And now when they're showing their mini tombs, they're also bringing a lot of that intellectualism into the coffins themselves. And you've got Amduat stuff showing up. You've got texts that were previously unattainable now showing up in these coffins, which is really cool. Now, the 20th dynasty is always going to be a problem for me because I only have 6 coffins that definitely belong to it. 6. 6, people. That's crazy. Didn't I just tell you that in the 21st dynasty that comes after, how many coffins did I say we've got? About 800 coffins. So all the 20th dynasty coffins are underneath the plaster and paint of the 21st dynasty coffins, and I will find them. I will hunt them down, and I will find them. So here we've got I have over 700. I keep finding new ones, so my number keeps going up, which scares me in terms of a research project. But I'm working it through. Do you see the inside of this piece? How beautifully decorated it is. Now you can see the interior. It's just gorgeous.
Could you comment on the construction and wood and so forth? Is there any particular change that's
There's not a huge particular change, mostly because let me say it very simply. Having gone to Italy, and I've also worked with some coffins in Northern Europe and some coffins in Cairo and other places, just from the Italian database of 80 coffins, what percentage of those do you think was reused that I could tell just with my eyes? Just guess. 75, 80% reused. So no, the wood isn't going to change too much, is it? Because they're all 19th and 20th dynasty coffins. So the construction depends a lot on the status of the elite individual who originally created it. If that person has access to Lebanese cedar or fir, then they're going to have nice, thick, big planks of wood. If they only have access to sycamore or acacia, then they'll be using smaller, scrappy pieces of wood. And the way they piece these things together is rather extraordinary, with dowels and pegs and other kinds of joins. And they're able to curve some of these pieces of wood as well. So yeah, the craftsmanship of the wood does not change, mostly because most of them are reused. So
do you have a non-cynical explanation for what happens to the body?
a non-cynical, I'm getting there. To the body, to the mummy?
Yes.
Absolutely, yes.
But how about from 19th to 20th in terms of the construction of the coffin and materials?
Right, so 19th to 20th, I've only got these 8, so I'm leery of telling you too much. What I do notice is that we see varnish going down in amount because varnish comes from resins that's often imported, so it's hard to get access to that, and I don't see as much black resin used on the inside. But yes, I'll talk more about that if you want after, if you're interested. So now we get to the thing that's haunting this whole talk, and that's this idea of recommodification, of reuse. And I've been working with this a lot. This is a papyrus it comes from the tomb robbery papyri, the so-called tomb robbery papyri, which talk about the trials that took place in Western Thebes that I don't have a whole lot of time to talk about that, but the tomb robbery papyri suggest to Egyptologists, and we have really bought into this for a long time, that the recommodification that took place was aberrant, was not normal, was something that was done in the dead of night in secret, something that people didn't know about, and when they found out, they had a big trial to talk about how horrible it was. And it seems to me, looking at the text in combination, and I have other texts that I'll talk about as well, in combination with the archaeological evidence, that this is much more quotidian than any of us would like to believe. Much more of this reuse happened by a family member going into his family tomb and recommodifying something that he could recommodify. So that seems to be what we're looking at. Okay, now I know this is a placeholder for me. I've gone through the Western Theban texts looking for theft or reuse or recommodification from private sources, not theft from the Valley of the Kings or any royal tombs, because that really is a different kind of recommodification. It did happen, but I want to look at how normal people or normal elites are dealing with the situation of scarcity. And here we see that when tombs are violated, we talk about owners being dragged out of their coffin, the funerary equipment being stolen, the gilding being stolen, the bodies being burned. Real problematic things are happening here in these texts. And when Egyptologists have looked at this, they've automatically associated this kind of activity with a moral problem, and thus assumed that it was a lower percentage of coffins that were being reused, or that this, when it happened, it was punished, that it was placed into a certain light. Now, when you look at the late Ramessid letters, you see some of the same ideas, but it broadens the situation, and it broadens it so that you see, and this is new work that's being done by people like Robert Rittner at Chicago, where they look at these texts, and for the first time people are saying, look, the high priesthood of Amun is in on it. They're leading this systematic clearance of the Valley of the Kings and of many elite tombs. This is something that they are doing to fund their own regimes. So when you look at the tomb robbery papyri, on the one hand, it seems like these independent bands of thieves are roaming about in the dead of night and doing these aberrant things. However, when you look at the late Ramessid letters, it's a different sort of situation. So the first text here, it's a British Museum papyrus. You have the temple workmen are told by the high priest and his scribe to look for a marker, and we think it's a physical marker of a tomb. And then they ask that the scribe of Necropolis be sent back to assist with this marker. And they're charged, quote, to open a tomb among the ancestors' tombs and to preserve the seal until the high priest of Amun arrives. So it's not explicitly stated. It's not exactly clear what's going on in here. And we have to build a number of circumstantial arguments to suggest that this is a systematic clearance at the hands of the high priest. But I think that I'm on the side of the people who are saying this is systematically done, and that the people on the top are a part of this. I'm not going to talk about this in detail. Again, this is just a placeholder for me. But what I also found looking at the text is that we have disputes between villagers in Western Thebes about tombs. And there's this one guy who opens up his tomb, and he sees all of a sudden, his family tomb, that there's nothing in it. There's just one coffin, and it's a coffin he doesn't recognize, and it belongs to somebody else. And he brings this up before the Kenbet, before the court, and there's an investigation and inquiry. They go in and they talk about it. They talk to the guy who's supposed to be guarding the tomb. He says, I don't know what happened. And this goes on for a number of texts. You can link together about 5 different ostraca into this one case. And it's very problematic. This is a big dispute about a tomb being opened without somebody knowing. So this, to me, suggests that this scarcity has affected people so much that they're also going into each other's tombs to deal with this problem if their own family tomb was not enough. So if you're going to take the body of either a beloved family member or a family member who died 6 generations before, or a person you don't even know, out of the coffin, and you're going to take that body and you're going to place it in a corner of the tomb, presumably you would do some sort of magical incantation, religious incantation to make sure that the dead would not rise against you or be upset in any way. Once you have done this, you as an Egyptian are automatically assuming that the most important use of this materiality is the ritual transformation of the dead after their death. That the primary purpose of the coffin is not to be there for eternity for the dead. The primary purpose of the coffin is to transform the dead right after their death. And once that transformation has taken place, then the coffin seems to, in the minds of many Egyptians at this time period, served its purpose, so that you can then reuse it for somebody else. Now this...
Why don't they just skip that process instead of having to take people out?
I know.
Just skip the process.
I know. I know. I have found no evidence of the Egyptians ever abandoning materiality, no matter how bad it got. It's extraordinary. They never get to the point where they're like, we don't need all this stuff. We don't need the transformative coffin. We don't need the discrete tomb for the dead. They actually, and I'll show, when I get to the mummy evidence, it really does push it in that direction. They don't ever abandon the idea that stuff is there to transform, stuff is there to turn the dead into something else, and that you need the stuff during that ritual moment to activate it.
Because, you know,
So.
changes in what you do happens all the time in terms of burial. Let's say late late Hellenistic Palestine. They change radically, and they managed to do it without having to keep track of
I know.
what used to be done in the past.
I know, no, this is this is Egyptian culture, right? I mean, even with the third intermediate period and the lack of resin coming in, the lack of wood coming in, they decide to go into their family tombs and reuse the coffins of the dead before, rather than changing any of that and changing the ideas of their religion that radically. It is extraordinary.
So, can I just ask
Yeah,
you,
please, please.
So they assume when they take the mummy out that they have already gone to the netherworld? So
I don't know what they assume, because the
is
Egyptians,
that the purpose?
Egyptian culture, if it's about this conservative innovation, right, if we're agreeing on that, Egyptian culture is also about not writing down anything that's considered bad or something that you don't want to talk about. You were never going to find a letter that says, so I took Aunt Marge out of the coffin today and I felt kind of bad about it, so I did this religious text and this thing, and so everything will be fine, but she doesn't need it anyway because I can only build circumstantial arguments given the behavior that I see, but I don't know what they thought was going to happen to this person who had been taken out of the coffin. I don't know. But I have to assume that since the pattern is pretty extraordinary and is being followed and increasing throughout the third intermediate period, and I see, you know, the coffins in Italy, I see, you know, men's coffins turn into women's coffins, then it goes back to, I mean, it's crazy stuff, how many times these things are reused. I suspect, though I can never really prove, that there were rental coffins out there, like a village parish coffin, that people would be buried in. The poor who couldn't afford a coffin would be transformed in. They would then be taken out of it, and they would be placed into a tomb and not have any materiality of a coffin to go with them, but they were transformed in it. Can I prove that? No. But I can use the behavior here to circumstantially build a case that suspects it. Yeah.
So what do you think it was about the coffin, what you're calling the materiality of the coffin?
Yeah, I know. When I say materiality, I mean that it's imbued with something more than just material. That's all I mean by that. But yeah.
Is it the fact that it's a container for the body?
Yes.
Imagery on it?
Yes.
It says texts on it?
Yes.
All of these together?
Yes. A coffin is an incredibly complicated thing. It is interior space and exterior space. It is masculine space and feminine space. It is a body that will never decay, but it's a container for that body and a womb at the same time. And like if you look at an 18th dynasty coffin, you see that black pitch resin. It's the underworld itself. It's the entrance into the underworld. And so it's Nut, it's the sky goddess, and you're placing the dead into that thing. And to abandon that for many people seems to have been, especially for those people at the higher levels of society intellectually, for them, this was very problematic. They needed that object. The negotiation I see is, do you need that object eternally, or do you need the object for the ritual? And that's a negotiation that is constantly being waged, this battle. And the rich are constantly fighting to keep their tombs super protected, super secret, and to maintain that materiality as long as they can with their body discreet. But when we get to the mummies, you'll see they had very grave doubts about whether or not their coffins would follow them with them into the afterlife forever. And they thus tricked out their bodies in ways that we have never seen before.
You know what is also likely? That the coffin itself will have its value on the basis of who was buried in it at one time.
True.
Because some of them were important people.
And if you look at, okay, so a really good way to follow that up is to look at kings reusing previous kings' coffins. So you see the third intermediate, Or statues, absolutely. Amenhotep III, and who goes after him? Ramses II and Merneptah. And they reuse those things like crazy. But the sarcophagus, a granite sarcophagus of Merneptah, was found inside of Susenes II's tomb in Tanis. So, and he recarves it. But, you know, sometimes there's like the traces of the old name is there. It's very visible. For kingship, it's been easier for Egyptologists to deal with that. Because of the royal ka, that spirit going from one king to the next king to the next. I am him and he is me and we are one. I think it's easier for us to deal with the morality of that problem. And I think it's harder for us to think that everybody in Egypt is a tomb robber. That's a little harder.
So it's important not to put morality as an
It is. That's why I say recommodification. And everyone laughs when I say that. But it's true.
For the non-royals, how many generations?
Depends. When the
Before
first,
this
okay, so
all
this
went
one
off.
here, do you see the decoration underneath? This is 19th dynasty decoration. This is 20th dynasty decoration.
Not very long.
And they've replastered, well, 7 generations, I would guess. Maybe a little less, maybe a little more, but about 7. As time goes on, this is the first instance of reuse that I've seen, where you've got replaster and repainting. I'll show you more. I see much less by the time we get deep into the 21st dynasty and to the end of the 22nd, where it's just maybe 1. The style it becomes more difficult because people are much lazier about the reuse as time goes on, and they don't change as much. Here's another coffin. This is in Copenhagen. And here we have this human foot, well, wooden foot, please. So this foot here carved out of the wood. This is not stylish in Dynasty 21. So this person reused this coffin, and they replastered it with a pretty hefty amount of plaster, right? You see all the cracking here to cover up that foot, and then repainted it as well. And so we see a lot of care taken into making sure that this is reused in a way so that people don't see that they've taken over a piece. I would say the number of generations here would be much greater. It would probably be like 10 or 11 generations that have come between. This coffin here in Turin was, Lisa will know about this, it's a coffin made for a woman in the 19th dynasty as if she's in the dress of an right? And it shows all of her female undulations. It's a very unusual coffin type that you only see in the 19th dynasty. And it shows the human feet, and it shows her arms not like this, but like this, with one arm down on her thigh. And they didn't replaster it. They just repainted it. So I looked at this coffin and went, whoa, so strange, because all of her human, feminine undulations are there. And they just repainted it. But they didn't replaster it to give it the nice 21st dynasty sort of sterility of a male-female androgynous body. They didn't do that. They kept the arms as they are, even though that's rather strange. And the feet, they kept the feet. They didn't plaster over them. And they put little sandal straps on them, which I think is rather sweet, right? So they are redoing it. They're repainting it. But I think that most people would have looked at this, well, maybe not most, but many people would have looked at this and known immediately, this is an older coffin. They've repainted this. Egyptologists have a harder time with this. This coffin is published as being archaizing, as following an older style, right? So the person that's looking at this is like, oh, this is interesting. These people are going back to the 19th dynasty and looking at what they were doing, and they're copying that, and they're trying to bring this idea back. No, they're just using a 19th dynasty coffin for somebody else and putting a new name on it and repainting it in a different style. That's how hard it is for us to see this as being as pervasive as it was. We instead say that it's archaism. And here's a coffin in Florence that has, it's wonderful that I did this book on 19th and 20th dynasty coffins, because I'm able to go in, not as a 21st dynasty coffin scholar, but as a, 19th and 20th, and then I'm working into the 20th. I'm able to see the 19th dynasty decoration very quickly, because I stared at these things for years, right? That's what a dissertation does to you. It becomes a part of your brain. And I went in and I saw this. I'm like, oh, it's a 19th dynasty coffin, but the lid has I know you can't see this. It's not in great shape. But the Florence is not in great shape. I'll just say, like, the whole place. The lid is in bad shape, but they've tried to redecorate it for a 21st dynasty aesthetic. But they didn't redo the case sides. So they try to match the coloring and the painting so that the lid matches the case sides, which they're not changing, which is, that's extraordinary to me. Now, sometimes we see a different kind of reuse, recommodification taking place. This is the high priest of Amen and general. That's how conflated these positions were at this time period, Masaharta. And his tomb was in a tomb cache that was not discovered until the 1880s. A tomb cache whose secrecy won. And this is an inner coffin And when archaeologists found it, they took off the lid of the outer coffin, and look, he has no hands and he has no face. These were gilded hands, gilded face, which means that his own peers, his own people, went in and took these objects off of his coffin. And not only that, they picked the inner coffin. It's very clever. If you're going into a tomb in the dead of night and you're burying another family member in the secret cache, and they did a very good job of keeping it secret, and you're there with, what, 5 other guys, and you've dragged this coffin up and you're putting it in the right place, and you're standing there and you're like, guys, what do you think? Let's just take something. Let's do something. We need something. And they all agree, okay, we'll take something. Well, okay, let's do that coffin there. It's massa heart. It's okay. Take it from the inside. Okay, so they don't take anything from the outside. You remove the lid. You take the thing from the inside, put the lid back on, and who's to know? First of all, this isn't a place that people are parading through all the time. It only is open when the next person is buried. And to take something from an inner piece is very cagey, very clever. And the rich knew this. They saw this happening. They quickly decided to abandon gilding and instead move towards yellow paint. So this is a 19th dynasty example here, and it's fully gilded. This is a piece in the British Museum, drop dead gorgeous. It's lovely. But it's too dangerous, even if you have the cash, even if you have the gold. Because if these are the same people that are melting down the gold in the Valley of the Kings, trust me, they have the gold. They've got the money. But they cannot put it on their coffins, because if they do that, then somebody will come, and now we get into the deep religious, emotional issues, with a chisel and start scraping off their face and their body of their sacred container. This is not something you need to do. So now we have a negotiation between, I have a lot of money on the one hand, but I can't put it on my coffin because someone's going to steal it on the other. I want to show how important I am on the one hand, but I don't want people to rip off my face and hands on the other. So this is an interesting conflict of interests between the Egyptians themselves in their own mind. How do they deal with this materiality, this very functional materiality? So we see interest in a lot of things as time goes on. We see an interest in lack of gold. We see an interest in making sure that everything is very efficiently displayed so that you can have a discrete burial that is, about this big. So it'll fit very easily into a cache tomb with hundreds of other coffins. That tomb that I'm talking about in Deir el-Bahri that kept its secrecy until the 1880s, it had hundreds and hundreds of nesting coffins in it. So about 600 coffins were found in that one cache altogether, because these are nested together, right? Inner coffin inside of an outer coffin inside of something, go on and on. You could have 3 coffins in a set. So we need an efficient display. And we abandon the idea of having a big sarcophagus. A big sarcophagus, it makes a big splash, it's true, but it's not something you can hoist up into a cliffside tomb when you're rappelling into it. This is not useful. It's not something that is a space-saving device. This is a big thing. And it demands a lot of wood. So we abandon the idea of this rectangular sarcophagus in favor of the nesting coffins. And so I've called this is a defensive materialism. They never abandon the materialism itself. They shift it. They make it defensive. They try to protect themselves, but they try to keep their stuff at all costs. And now we get to the mummification. Okay, I'll do this quickly. And this is what I'll be focusing on at the Frist, because who doesn't want to look at this all the time? At this time period, in the 21st dynasty, amongst a very small group of elites who are able to afford it, we see the apex of mummification. We see mummification develop in such a way so that people were not just having their bodies embalmed so that the skin attached itself to the skull and you had this wizened, skinny sort of body. They plumped up the skin. They created an incision here and then would push sawdust and fabric and other things up into the skin, sometimes fabric that's been impregnated with fatty substances to give it a nice sort of, facelift for death. They would add human hair extensions, sometimes wigs, sometimes false hair, sometimes real hair, but they would make sure that the dead went in with some kind of hair. They plastered and painted the surface of the skin so that once it was all plumped out, so that it had this nice lifelike appearance. And they placed, underneath these pads here, they had, and I'll come back to this one. They placed stone eyes into the eye sockets. Previously, the mummy had been depicted as if asleep, closed eyes. Now the mummy is awake. And I would argue that the mummy is meant to stand on its own as a coffin. The mummy can now look and see like a coffin could look and see. And you know, we have peppercorn stuffed into the nose to make sure the nose doesn't collapse on itself. We're actually putting padding in the arms and into the chest and thorax. It's extraordinary. The work and time and the expense that went into something like this. You're creating a body, a thing, a materiality out of flesh and bone, something that cannot be recommodified. This is the only part of the burial that no one has any interest in. It is discrete to that one person. It cannot be taken out. It is not abstracted like a coffin. It can't be removed and resurfaced for anybody else. It only serves the dead. So it's an incredibly defensive thing, very clever to then put all of your money into this body, to trick out this body and to show people, well, we'll stay on the body, what it is you're capable of doing. Now, this doesn't last. It lasts for about 150 years, and I'll talk more about this at the Frist. But again, I have to build circumstantial arguments out of this. I would suggest, and I'm going to do so very quickly here, you can follow up with me later, that the reason it doesn't last longer is because the ability to display such a thing was very limited. The Egyptians would never believe you could display a naked corpse, an unwrapped corpse, to a large group of people, or maybe to a group of people larger than 5. I mean, this is something that needed to stay in the embalming workshop. This is a very vulnerable state that the body was in. It needed to be wrapped and protected, placed into all of those coffins. What are those coffins for? You have all of those nesting coffins to create force fields around the dead so that they could be protected. But we have...
To that, no one wants to have the body that they died in. They want to have the body that it was painted on the walls.
It's true, but if everyone's taking your coffins, you can't have any painting on the walls, and people are ripping off your face and hands off of your coffin. It seems to be people are interested in creating a body that is as unlike the dead body as possible. So they're and that's really what mummification is, right? But this is the best mummification we have ever seen as Egyptologists and that we'll ever see as time goes on. This is it. They're trying to create a body that is like a coffin, that can function without a coffin and can see and touch and be, but also have the fullness of limbs and not be this scary dead body that will last.
You miss the trickiness of it.
Yeah.
The trickiness is that you do not want to have the body that you have. You want to have a perfected body in the afterlife. Otherwise, why bother?
Yes and no. From the Egyptian perspective, the elites always maintained that mummified body as the core of the burial. That's the thing that it all surrounds. I agree with you that every image is trying to improve upon that body. But in the end, when the Ba soul returns to the body, it's returning to the actual corpse. It has to be, in the Egyptian mindset, the actual corpse for it to unite with. And if your body is burned or lost or dismembered, and all of these books of the dead, Book of the Dead texts talk about this, it's a very large problem. Possibly a problem that means your afterlife itself is compromised. It won't exist. So, yes, I agree with you. It must be perfected, and yet, for the Egyptians, and this is where we get to the core of their understanding of how functional charged material is, that body, even if it's scary and dead, is still the source of it all. So, by the time we get to this period, they move that source forward in a way that is, quite extraordinary in what it's able to do. And I would argue granted a kind of psychological security to people who were stealing from each other and who knew that the chances that their materiality would survive intact was very limited. I'm going to end it there. I have a couple more slides about things and stuff, but it's on the hour, so I think we should stop. And any questions, but please stay as long as you can if you have questions. I'll stay here. Let me turn on the lights. Yeah. From the restaurant. Yeah, great. Thanks.
As far as the tomb robbers, like you were just talking about what does happen about the soul not returning to the body in its proper form, and having no semblance of an afterlife, like if someone burns your corpse. So, is there a moral code? Like, is there something where the robbers, even if they are family members, get punished? Like
the punishment is. There is little information about the punishment from the tomb robbery papyri, but it seems that the worst of them were impaled.
Okay.
So it's like crucifixion, but instead of, you're on a pointy stick for days, put into a place where you're not just going to fall through, and you just...
You get the point.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So, and there's a little hieroglyph that shows the guy like on the stick, impaled.
There
So,
is like punishment.
direct visual display of punishment, as far as we can tell. But in typical Egyptian fashion, they don't talk about it very much.
Yeah.
It's very
that's why I was
annoying.
Like, is there evidence of, are there writings like, okay, this is what happened, and these are the stages you go
I mean, the other evidence for punishment, and there are studies of punishment out there. The harem conspiracies of Ramses III, and we think he may have died in this. There's disagreement, but if he did die in this conspiracy, it doesn't really matter. But there were people that were going after the king, and as far as we can tell, they were forced to commit suicide. What that entailed, I like people going, oh no, that's all elites get to commit suicide. That's the good way to go. That's an elite way to go. Well, you are going to die. Well, we'll let you do it yourself, and you get to choose the method and drink poison or whatever. I mean, it's fine.
Harakiri is not fun.
No. I mean, it depends on the method you choose.
So if you had a beautified mummy, did you get over to the other world faster?
There is very little discussion of status differentiation in terms of afterlife success. Does that make sense? There is little discussion of that, and this is something else that is new to Egyptology. If you pick up Jan Assmann's book, Death and the Afterlife in Ancient Egypt, he discusses it as most Egyptologists do. The Egyptians did this, the Egyptians did that, the Egyptians had coffins, the Egyptians believed in this. But it's not that way. It's that 5% of Egyptians who could afford the education and the ability to buy these things did this. What did everyone else do? Not so sure. And to look at the gradient as you move down into the population is very interesting. And we're just starting to look at that material. And there are Ramessid tombs of the poor who are cached. I mean cached, it means they're burying themselves with a large group of other people that are buried in a fetal position, right towards the rising sun. Completely different method of burial than you would see with an elite tomb, which is like very eye-opening. You realize that there may have been a parallel religious belief system that went alongside the developing elite religious belief system of death that didn't depend as much on stuff, on transformation through materiality. Because if you can't have, if you're a farmer who's barely feeding his family and you have no access to that material, either you have this existential freak out your whole life, or you have a religious system that supports your lack of ability to pay for these things. And I think that's much more likely, given the way human nature is, right?
And if your body's mutilated or burned or whatever, do you just disappear?
As far as we know, a mutilated body is... The Book of the Dead is very clear. The King Tut's mask, right? What is the text on the underside of that mask? The text for how not to lose your head. This is a huge fear. And what falls off of the mummy first? The head. Because it's, how are you going to keep it together with those vertebrae, right? So it becomes detached very easily. The Egyptians saw that. And their fears about losing this body that is so ugly and nasty, it's true, but their fears about this are put into their most religious documents. How do you not lose your head? How do you keep your limbs intact? What gods will be there to knit you together and keep you whole? And then you create the 4 sons of Horus, and they're responsible for this organ and that organ, and it's a very complicated system of apotropaic materiality. Yeah, but what would happen if you lost your head? That is not ever explicitly stated. Do you run around like a headless person? Maybe. And then there's the idea if you go into the afterlife and you eat excrement and drink urine because it's the opposite of what you do here, or you're upside down all the time. These are things you have to try to correct and do have something to do with the body. There's body about all of that, right? Yeah.
By the way, we have texts from 18th century Mari.
Yeah.
Where king knew exactly where the tombs of the previous kings are.
Yeah.
And they had no problem going in there and giving instruction what to take from there. So,
Really?
Yes. The tomb of Yahlunlin. So basically it is not an unknown phenomenon. And in fact, I can imagine that even in the 12th dynasty or in the 18th dynasty, people were doing
I'm sure of it.
Because
I'm sure of it.
Recycling is not...
Yeah.
See, here it is. It's a matter of aesthetics, right? In a sense, most of the stuff that you have is gold, wood, whatever it is. I'm not sure that people actually place an aesthetic value to these artifacts that have been created. Their value is the melting value of them, right?
If you're taking it.
If you're taking it.
Yeah.
And so basically,
I
you
agree.
are not destroying heirlooms.
Yeah.
You are creating actively needed material.
Yeah,
So
I
the
agree.
mentality is
I
different,
agree.
you see.
I agree. Yeah. Yeah. When it becomes really interesting to me is when I see the reuse in a 21st dynasty coffin that could only be one generation. Then I wonder what the moral implications or emotional implications were for that person. If they didn't know the other person, okay, but I mean, these are all objects meant to be displayed as well, which is interesting. It's like, it's not just like you steal a car and you go driving around in it. You steal the car and you put it in a parade.
See, the
You know,
equivalent
you
to what-
repaint it and then you put it in a parade. And so that's extraordinary.
the
It must be
equivalent to
shown.
what you have with these stones inside the mummy's head, that is to preserve the person as they are at the ultimate, is what you have the ossuary of the Roman period, because that is the ultimate essence of the person, and it is small enough that no one wants to bother
It's
with
true.
it.
And
not
it's still
expensive
you
enough,
still have to buy your
and
way
you're
into
still
that
complete
group,
in it.
and you're still amongst your peers, and there's still a social status involved in the placement of that ossuary.
And that
Yeah.
took a while to get there. I mean, it was not something that developed, and it was not purely economic. It was a
No, I never want to say purely economic. Never purely.
because
But
the
that's
20th
part of it.
dynasty is a
Never
very
purely, but
wealthy-
it's part of it.
The 20th dynasty is a pretty wealthy dynasty, despite all the problem they had. So.
Yeah. Good. Anybody else? No? Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much.